31 through 34, and I will read it from the Message version. That's right. The time is coming when I will make a brand new covenant with Israel and Judah. It won't be a repeat of the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took their hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant, even though I did my part as their master. God's decree. This is the brand new covenant that I will make with Israel when the time comes. I will put my law within them, write it on their hearts, and be their God. And they will be my people. They will no longer go around setting up schools to teach each other about God. They'll know me firsthand. The dull and the bright, the smart and the slow. I'll wipe the slate clean for each of them. I'll forget they even sinned. God's decree. So as I was looking at the Leader magazine and the theme for today, I'm not really a preacher. And so to come up with a whole new sermon is like kind of a daunting task. So I went to my bookshelf of all the theological books and I just like pulled them out, like, what's in there? What can I use? And this really ancient looking book by Walter Brueggemann was one of the books that we had laying on the tables when we left the old building. Like there was the tables and tables and tables of books. And I saw Walter Brueggemann's name, which I'm a big fan of his. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take that one. And I've never actually read the whole thing yet. But one of the chapters was like perfectly on point for our theme today. And of course we can't get through a whole chapter of a book, so I'm not going to read a whole chapter. But what I'm going to do is read like a little snippet here, a little snippet there, a little snippet. So I hope it flows okay, but it's not actually the way it's written. And obviously this is a really, really old book, so it's all he pronouns. Of course, we all know that you don't have to use he pronouns for God. But I will read it that way so I don't confuse myself. God is not like any other. He is with his people. He is for his people. His goodness is not in his great transcendental power, nor in his majestic remoteness, nor in his demanding toughness, but in his readiness to be with and for his people. And in being with and for, it's not a matter of bribery or deception or intimidation. He simply wills it so. He is not in his characteristic by himself. He is for others. The central theme of the Bible is covenant. The notion of making commitments and keeping them, of making promises and fulfilling them. This theme emerges as central to the Bible because God revealed himself as a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. That's who he is. That is how he meets Israel and relates to the church. That's how he relates to his creation as a faithful covenant keeper. That's how he defines our world for us as a process of covenant making and covenant keeping. And that is the good news of the gospel, that he is faithful to his covenanting. The Lord is actively engaged for his people. I think that was one of the things that stood out to me about what Nathan said last week, is that God doesn't just work through us, that God is actively engaged, God's self, and we might get to hop on with what God's already doing in the world. Okay, back to Brueggemann. God observes our trouble, affirms that he takes it seriously, is decisive, and actively engaged. He inserts himself into the crisis on behalf of the helpless ones. He fights for those who cannot defend themselves, and he does not fight for those who deserve it and might win anyway, but precisely for the helpless and worthless because he is with them and for them. It is the power of the gospel that he not only abides with, but is engaged for his people, doing what they most need but cannot do. He does something. Life is changed. His presence consists in his faithful action to transform life. Where he is, life is changed. Hope is possible. Exile is ended. To be his people means to permit life to be transformed and renewed by his intrusive purposes. The history of the Lord with his people and for his people is surely what comes to full expression in Jesus of Nazareth. The church's doctrine of incarnation, the word becoming flesh, is not some metaphysical doctrine. It's rather the church's confession that in radical self-commitment of Jesus to the powerless and the worthless of his time, we can discern the full commitment of God himself to his world and life-giving ways. We are bold to affirm that in Jesus we know fully and unmistakably that God is not only with us, but for us. The birth announcement of Jesus is the assertion that God is powerfully at work for those who cannot fight their own battles. The coming of Jesus is the Lord radically and powerfully with his people in times of distress to rescue them. Jesus is the means through which God's faithful covenanting is evident to his people. And then this is a section about who Jesus is. He brings power to people whose power is faint and low. He brings food to people desperately hungry. He brings healing where disease seemed to rule. He brings life where death was all they could anticipate. Jesus had no magical power. He was rather the central way in which God showed who he was. The rich man who for your sake became poor. The full one who for our sake became empty. The living one who faithfully laid down his life. To be with another may only be an act of momentary condescending charity, but to be for another means to be vulnerable in the situation of another, to suffer with and die for, to be subjected to the conditions and risks of another, to have one's person called into question like that of the other. That is God's goodness, unlike the goodness of any other God. He shows who he is by his capacity to enter into the suffering of others, to be identified totally with them, not to be helpless there, but still to be for the other with fresh power. No wonder he's a peculiar God, like whom there is no other. Nothing and nobody can separate us. Nothing can come between God and the people of his covenant. This is not because we have a religious bias in our life or that we merit anything, but because of him. He wills covenant. He's with us because it is his purpose to be, and he will not be thwarted. And we rely on that, on his faithful intention to be with us in order to be for us. Such faithfulness is a scandal. It violates all our religious conventions, for we prefer a God not to be so intensely set on us. The scandal is that it seems not to be so, and we do not wish it so because it destroys the way we would arrange life. It need hardly be said that this good news calls our whole way of existence into question. It questions our reading of public life, for we would like to organize it in ways which violate his passion and his compassion. It also questions our self-perception. If we are indeed in his image, then the central task of our life is covenant making and covenant keeping. It's a promise both rich and heavy for us to say that finally we shall be like him. Thus, our central human vocation is to be with brothers and sisters and for brothers and sisters. That is who he is, and that is who we are called to be, expected to be, promised to be.